So Briahna Joy Gray was on Megyn Kelly's show, which I don't know if you guys know this, but Megyn Kelly does have her own show now. You know, she's not a part of Fox. And I don't know if you guys know about this too, but she did reveal like about the sexual harassment that she went through at Fox while she was there. They made a movie about it. I think it's called Bombshells or something like that. But Briahna Joy Gray was on there and they're talking about elites and the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. And there was something that I noticed from this interview, something that I noticed was missing. And I'll tell you about that in just a second, but let's go ahead and get into this video first. And the name of the segment is called Out of Touch Elites from Left and Right. And this is with Bri and Megyn Kelly. Listen to what is said here.
You had like what's happening now with the Dems. You had this elitist, more establishment group of, with all due respect to Mitt Romney types, who were, sort of seemed perfect on paper to become president or, be a leader, but really were not connecting with the masses, with the Republican working class, the Democrat working class, couldn't get those Reagan Democrats back into the fold. And then we had Trump come on the scene and just completely blow everything up. And he did connect with them. And that's how he won. And now it's like the Democrats are the party of the elite, the Harvard educated, we know better than you. And they don't seem all that worried like they used to be about how people are doing in the unions and whether they're earning, a real livable wage and listening to their real complaints, as opposed to being like, shut up and vote Democrat. That's what's good for you.
So I'm going to chime in here. What Megyn just said right there, and I agree with Megyn on that point. She's right. Like, Democratic Party has become the party of the Harvard elite. They're not really connecting with working class people. And the Democratic Party used to be for the working class or whatever you want to call it. But and no, yeah, it has changed. It is pretty much the party for the Harvard elites, Goldman Sachs. So she is right about that. I do agree with that. But that is still not the main issue. But I'm going to tell you that in a minute, and I'll let the video play.
Well, there are real structural reasons as to why this has happened, right? There is no party in America that is truly invested in the welfare and growth and strength of unions the way there used to be. Union rights were decimated over the course of the 70s and 80s by Republican administrations. And third wave neoliberal Democrats didn't do much to step in and save them in the 90s and 2000s. And so now one of the most powerful groups that could stand in defense of workers no longer has the political traction that it used to. At the same time, rules surrounding the influence of money in politics have been corrupted to the extent to which the polls show, a Princeton study from a few years ago showed that there is almost no relationship, none, between the preferences of American voters and politicians, because the predominant preferences that are expressed, that get through to politicians, are those from lobbyists and special interest groups. And that's not helping anybody of any political party or affiliation.
So again, I agree with Bri here. She's right. Like, they're not listening to the working class people. They're listening to people who are more so, lobbyists and special interest groups. But again, that's still not the root issue. I'll go back in.
Yes, this is why it's funny, because I feel like people on sort of the Bernie Sanders team, whether it's you or Crystal Ball or I just a big collection, are kind of meeting the more working class Republicans, and the Republican Party itself is becoming the party of the working class in a strange place, right? Like strange bedfellows are being formed here, because it seems like now the Democrat Party has become the party of elite that doesn't really care about, the Democrats love unions. They love the union bosses. They don't care about the actual workers. Otherwise, they'd be handling it a lot differently.
Well, I would be really clear about this. Republicans are winning no awards here. It's a race to the bottom. And
the Republicans hate unions altogether.
Right, exactly. So it is important that at least under Joe Biden, you have an LRB that's willing to enforce labor laws, for instance. It matters in the labor disputes and the wave of strikes that we've seen across the country. It matters that Amazon is getting a review of, or the Amazon workers, rather, are getting a review of whether or not their union efforts were unfairly tampered with by the corporation. Those kind of things matter, and that's why it matters to have Democrats in office as opposed to Republicans. But I don't identify as a Democrat, and part of the reason why is because better than the other guy isn't serving the people the way it should be. And the reality is, I had a recent episode with Batya Ungar-Sargon, who has written this really interesting book about how media, the way that media is covering working class issues has really affected the way that populations see themselves reflected in politicians. And she has a really interesting and important account about how the failure of kind of populist media has resulted in what we have today. But one thing that her studies and her charts in her book reveal is that there is an incredibly elite leadership on the right as well. Papers like The Economist and the Washington Journal have elite audience as well. And while they might have go into identity politics every now and then, when it comes to core economic and financial commitments, they always align with the 1%. So what we have is two parties that talk about identity, that have these culture wars in order to distract from the extent to which both parties, leadership in both parties, are ignoring the needs of the worker. Majorities of Republicans want a $15 minimum wage or higher. Florida voted for a $15 minimum wage at the same time it voted for Donald Trump to be president by 60%. 60% of Florida voters wanted the $15 minimum wage. And as upset as I am that Joe Biden hasn't fought for it, I'm infinitely more disappointed in Republicans who are categorically ignoring what their base wants as well.
Okay. And I'm glad that Bree brought it back to that point, because sometimes you have to be careful when you go on to a conservative show, because obviously they're going to say bad things about Democrats. They're going to say bad things about the left. And I do not consider Democrats and the left to be the same thing. I consider Democrats to be liberals. I consider leftists to be further left than liberals. But you do have to be careful when you go into these conservative shows, because you know that they are going to say bad things about Democrats and about leftists, and that you may agree with, that I agree with. Like the things that Megyn Kelly said, I do agree with. But you always have to bring it back to the fact that Republicans are also guilty of doing these same things. And I'm glad that Bree did that, because it can be easy to just kind of agree with the criticisms of the left and the Democratic Party and not bring in the criticisms of the right as well. So I'm glad that she did that. However, that is still not the root issue. Yes, these things that they are saying, all of these things are happening, but we're not hearing the why. Hang on, I'm still going to tell you.
I mean, I am with you on the need to take a hard look at why people who are working very hard cannot get ahead in this country anymore. The diminishing American dream is a real thing. And we need to be honest about that and how systems need to change. Why do we have these like oligarchs like Jeff Bezos now, right? Like these people at the top of these massive companies who are just swimming in billions of wealth, while their workers are toiling away making crap. I mean, they have no lives. They can't see their families. They don't have good vacations. They don't understand why they have to sacrifice yet another day with their kids so that Jeff Bezos can have yet another home. I get that. I totally get that. But I also think I can argue with you about the minimum wage, because I think that leads to the destruction of jobs. I mean, we've seen it happen time after time where companies, especially with these inflation rates, say, I can't do that. Like my margins aren't good enough, and I'm not going to be able to make it back. And then I'm just going to have to eliminate positions. Like I can pay my 2 people $15 an hour, but I could have had 10 at $10 or $9 an hour.
So Megyn Kelly says that she gets that. She understands that. But I do want to remind you that Megyn Kelly is a millionaire. So again, this is where the class issue comes back in. It's easy to say that you understand that or you get that, but do you really, really know what it's like to have to struggle like that? Do you know what it's like to try to make a living in this country when you're making minimum wage? Do you know what it's like to have to work 50 hours a week, 60 hours a week with 2 jobs, 3 jobs just to pay your rent? Do you really know, Megyn? I don't think so. I don't think so.
But when you look at how much money has been earned by our extremely productive workforce, remember, Americans have only gotten more productive over time. Over the last 30 or 40 years, an enormous percentage, the overwhelming majority of profits from that productivity have gone to the 1%. So
Yes.
this isn't an issue to your point about there not being enough money to go around. The issue is that CEOs, corporatists have been able to keep more profits, steal more profits from their workers who are really doing the labor.
Well,
than they
no, I
did in
agree with you. Like when I look at Jeff Bezos, I want him to pay as much as humanly possible to every Amazon worker. You know, when I see these big corporations, but when it's a smaller business, I just think, you know, you can't hit them with those kinds of minimums because their margins are just too small. Like the workers will wind up paying.
Well, here's some other, you know.
One thing I want to mention here, because the smaller businesses, this is one that I hear a lot as to why we can't pay people a $15 minimum wage. I think it should be higher than that. Part of the reason why some of those smaller businesses will struggle to do that is because they're paying for other things for the employee, right? So if we had universal health care, they wouldn't have to worry about giving people health insurance. That's something they could eliminate. Oh, we don't have to worry about paying for health insurance. If we had paid leave for everyone in this country, guaranteed by the federal government, they wouldn't have to even pay people for paid leave. These are some of those costs that can be cut from the employer if the United States government would just give people a freaking life. Give us some of these same benefits that people have in other countries. Just give people a freaking life. So when people bring that talking point to you, make sure you bring it back to that point. You ask that question, but why will those small businesses struggle to pay them an increase in minimum wage? That's how you bring it back to the socialist perspective. I'm going to go back in, but that's still not getting to the root cause of the problem.
This is an interesting conversation because oftentimes these progressive issues are framed as being anti-worker and anti-small business. When the reality is, for instance, having Medicare for all, not making small business owners pay the medical costs for their insurers would be the single biggest boon to small business owners in the that exists, right? The single biggest cost for small business owners.
Doja.
Is providing health insurance for their employees. And if instead of having to have employers take it out of people's paychecks and then have Americans paying twice as much that compared to any other similarly industrialized country for worse outcomes medically than other industrialized countries, we simply paid half as much as we're paying to health insurance in taxes for a program that is as well run and as admired as Medicare, i.e. Medicare for all, and that's an enormous business saving. And to your point about inflation, it's important to note that inflation right now is not being driven by spending at all. It's being driven by these supply side issues that are caused by COVID. And what's at the root of those?
In part.
Policies. In the 90s, it sent so many of our jobs overseas so that we have to import so much. There's no more storage capacity here in America because everyone has tried to cut the margin so slim so that CEOs can earn and so that shareholders can earn and can be paid dividends at the cost of the American worker.
I don't disagree with that either. I don't disagree with that either. Yeah, shipping all our jobs over to China has had American workers pay real costs on a number of fronts. It's funny, you know, we do like, in no world could I vote for Bernie Sanders. I have to be honest. I don't think, but
now she says she gets all of those things and she understands all of those things, but she will still continue to be loyal to her party. And this is the problem that we have in this country. If you agree that Amazon workers should be paid more, if you think the minimum wage is too low, if you think that there are problems here where the CEOs are being paid way too much, these enormous amounts of salaries, while the workers below them are being exploited and are barely making enough to get by, you agree with all those things, but then you come back and say, but I could never vote for Bernie Sanders. The reason being is because you are a party loyalist. And this is a big problem that we have in this country. So many Americans have been brainwashed or they've been raised by their families. You're Republican, we're Republican, you're Republican. We're Democrat, you're Democrat. That's what we do in this house. They have become party loyalists to the point where they can agree with you on every issue and still not vote for that candidate that they agree with. They will continue to vote for the person that is in their party because they are party loyalists. But that is still not the root problem.
I agree. Whenever I hear you talk, I'm like, I agree with what she's saying. When I hear Crystal talk, I'm like, I agree with that too. But then, sort of taken to its logical extreme, some of these things, I'm like, that's where I draw the line. But I'm not a Republican and I'm not a Democrat, just like you either. I'm sort of like, who makes sense and who's reasonable? And I do see the country dividing now into people who are rational and irrational, who make sense and who don't make sense. And for sure, there is an elites versus regular people problem that needs to be completely busted open. And it's manifest in my industry and your industry more than any other, right?
And that's the same thing that Bernie Sanders said. But notice she said she could never vote for Bernie Sanders. You guys following this logic?
When it comes to government politicians and journalists, they're the least trusted among us because they all have their own skin in the game and the consumer knows it.
Yeah, I think that's why you're seeing the proliferation of podcasts, independent media, shows like Crystal Balls and Saga and Jetties really taking off. You see people like yourselves who have had amazing careers in mainstream media, finding platforms and a huge audience on YouTube and these other places because folks are decoupling from the cable box. I don't know anybody in my generation, I'm 36 years old, who has cable, really.
Yep.
We're all just watching the clips on Twitter to the extent that Paul Begula says something ridiculous. And it's partly because we're not reflected there. I remember at certain points during the campaign, certain folks who were pegged as the, progressive spokesperson, the person who was going to speak for progressives on some of these mainstream news outlets, would call me and ask, hey, what do the progressives think about X, Y, and Z? What's the line? And I would think, well, you could just ask me on. You could just ask what the thousands of people who are out here writing articles for progressive outlets, independent news media, all of these people who have these podcasts and this whole infrastructure, you could just let them on your network, but that's not how it works. And many of us have been officially or unofficially blacklisted, and the viewers notice. The viewers notice that they're not reflected and they're looking else.
Okay, we're going to get to root cause here, ladies and gentlemen. There's a couple of things I want to note. The main thing I noticed from that conversation is that there was a focus on the party issue instead of focusing primarily on the class issue. Because regardless if you have political parties in this country or not, let's pretend we did not have political parties. Let's pretend those disappeared. We would still have the class issue. Jeff Bezos would still be Jeff Bezos. Bill Gates would still be Bill Gates. Mark Zuckerberg would still be Mark Zuckerberg. And Elon Musk would still be Elon Musk. This is why I tell people oftentimes you have to look beyond left versus right, and you need to look at the class issue. Now, there was one word that was not mentioned that entire discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, I kept asking you, but what is the root cause? The root cause is not Republicans. It's not Democrats. The root cause and the root problem is capitalism. That is why these things are taking place. That is why you have corrupt politicians. You have politicians that can be bought. This is why you have CEOs doubling and tripling their salary during a pandemic while the workers have been laid off or underpaid or overworked, barely getting breaks or had their breaks removed from them, which caused so many workers in this country to go on strike. This is the reason why the people at the bottom that work for these organizations are constantly exploited. This is the point that you have to drive home. These things are happening not because of Democrat versus Republican. It's not because of Trump. It's not because of Trump versus Biden or Trump versus Hillary. It is solely because of capitalism. That is the main problem. And until you root that out, we will always have these issues. I will say this again. Even if we did not have political parties in this country, we would still have billionaires. We will still have JP Morgan. We will still have Wachovia. We will still have Wells Fargo. We will still have Goldman Sachs. So when people try to put it solely on the parties, this is how people get confused. This is how people stay divided in this country. This is why we are always pitted against each other, because we are focusing on the fact that so-and-so was in this party and I'm in this party. So we can't cross paths. We can't sit on the same side of the table. You can't sit next to us. This is the problem. And I'm hearing them talk about CEOs getting paid more. I'm hearing them talking about the minimum wage. But at the end of the day, the root cause is capitalism, and it's not mentioned. This is something that I mentioned when I went on RT, when he was talking about Republican versus Democrat. I've always brought it back to capitalism. When I appeared on that show, the show was Crosstalk. You can see it on my channel. I think it's the pinned video. I brought it back to capitalism. I said, at the end of the day, we are all being exploited by capitalism. That's what this is about. People don't want to say it. Not enough of us are saying it. And I don't know if people are afraid to say it because they're afraid that they're going to be called a socialist or a communist. And those words can scare people, or those words can make people feel uncomfortable. Now, we talked about this last night about people feeling uncomfortable. Maybe it's time for people to feel uncomfortable. Maybe it's time to wake people up in this country. We have to drive this back home. I'm going to show you just how bad capitalism can be in this country. Let me go to my sheet. Put my link in here. Hold on. I have a document that's going to show you what capitalism looks like. People like to talk about capitalism. A lot of times, especially in mainstream media, we hear capitalism spoken about in such a positive way. You get to make your own money, free market economy. But I want to show you some of the problems that we have with capitalism. Here are some of the problems that we have with capitalism, ladies and gentlemen. Boom. Inequality. Economic instability. Monopoly power. Short-termism. Environmental costs. By the way, that's a big one. There are a lot of people that say they're environmentalists, but they're capitalists. Capitalism is directly linked to environmental costs. So how can you be a capitalist and be an environmentalist at the same time? Immobilities. Monopsony. I can't pronounce it correctly, sorry. These are some of the problems that we have with capitalism in this country. Inequality. The benefits of capitalism are rarely equitably distributed. Wealth tends to accrue to a small percentage of the population. Now, this goes back to what Bernie was talking about when he mentioned the top 0.01%. Financial instability and economic cycle. Capitalism relies on financial markets, shares, bonds, money markets, but financial markets have a tendency to cause booms and busts. I'm not going to read the whole thing for you guys. I can put the link in the chat later. Monopoly power. In a free market, successful firms can gain monopoly power. This enables them to charge higher prices to customers. Supporters of capitalism argue only capitalism enables economic freedom. But the freedom of a monopoly can be abused and consumers lose out because they have no choice. Monopsony. Monopsony is market power in employing factors of production. For example, firms can have monopsony power in employing workers and paying lower wages. This enables firms to be more profitable, but can mean workers don't share the same level of proceeds as the owners of capital. We see this in the workplace. Immobilities. In a free market, factors of production are supposed to be able to easily move from an unprofitable sector to a new profitable industry. However, in practice, this is much more difficult. A farmer who is made unemployed cannot just fly off to a big city and find a new job. Look, me and Jordan was just talking about this. When I asked him, are people in Flint being offered any type of relocation assistance? Environmental cost and externalities. In capitalist economies, there is limited government intervention and reliance on free markets. However, market forces ignore external costs and external benefits. Therefore, we may get overproduction and overconsumption of goods that cause harmful effects to third parties. This can lead to serious economic costs, pollution, global warming, acid rain, loss of rare species, external costs that damage future generations. So, where are all my climate activists out there right now? If you're a climate activist, if you're an environmentalist, and you're seeing this right now, how can you still be a capitalist? Think I got one more left. Encourages greed and materialism. You don't say. The nature of capitalism is to reward profit. The capitalist system can create incentives for managers to pursue profit over decisions which would maximize social welfare. For example, firms are using theories of price discrimination to charge higher prices to consumers who want to jump the queue. This makes sense from the perspective of maximizing profit. However, if we have a society where the rich can pay to jump a queue at a fairground or pay to see congressmen quicker, it erodes social norms and a sense of fair play. I am putting this link for you in the chat. You can read this more yourself. This is highly important, and more people need to mention this. People on the left, we need to be talking about this. It's capitalism. That's the problem. It's not who you put in office. It's not who you voted for half the time. It's not what you're doing at your job. It's not the fact that you are, like what you're doing at your job. It's not the fact that if you can't get promoted, that's not your fault. Sometimes it's not even your employer's fault. It's capitalism. The reason why we have food deserts in this country, for those who don't know, a food desert is a community that does not have a grocery store. And we have them all across this country. We have them right here in towns in Massachusetts where there's no grocery store. And so people have to get their food from CVS and Walgreens, or they have to hopefully have a car and enough gas money to drive to the next town over that has a grocery store and then go grocery shopping. But if you don't have those things, you are subjected to the crap food at Walgreens and CVS. It is more common than you realize. People talk about this sort of thing, this food inequity in other countries, and they call them third world countries. By the way, they're not third world countries. A lot of times they're rich in resources. We just steal them. But they don't talk about those inequities right here in the United States. So we have food deserts here. Why? Capitalism. This is why I tell people you have to talk about the money. And I have a money story tomorrow night, which you are not going to like. You are not going to like. Yeah, I think I put the link in the chat, Eric. It's all about the money. When we think back to why isn't the squad doing what they said they would do? Capitalism. Who are they connected to? Who are they talking to? George just told you tonight. He was like, well, they want to play the game and to get where they want to get in their career. But why do they want to take those steps in the career? Why? There's more money involved. Capitalism. That's what I want you guys to take away from this tonight. This is the problem. This is why nothing gets done. This is why things don't change. This is why all of us can't have nice things, because of capitalism. This is why politicians don't do what they say they're going to do. This is why they can easily be bought. Even the ones who say they take grassroots money, and then you find out that money went somewhere else. But at the end of the day, that's what it comes down to. And I want us to call it out more. Thank you so much for hanging out with me tonight. I hope you learned something tonight. I know sometimes like my thumbnails can be a little like, woo, this is going to be party time. But I try to bring in serious elements I like to educate people. Thanks so much for the super chat, Craig Kidd. Capitalism is slavery light. Pretty much. Basically. Thank you so much for that. This is why we have that 99%. This is why you have a small amount of people at the top that have that concentrated wealth. It's because of capitalism. But what do I know? I'm just Sabby.